Hello and welcome back to my virtual classroom. Today we're going to talk about how to write a strong basic summary, strategizing for summarizing informational texts. Brought to you by Miss M&M. We can do it. So, the first thing we want to start off with is our analysis of the text. You want to go into whatever passage you have been assigned to summarize. For example, the shifting boundaries of adolescence. You want to identify the title of the article, the author of the article, and then once you finish reading the entire article, you want to be able to identify the main argument of the passage. Once you've done all of those things, you then want to go back and reread. Yes, you want to go back and reread so that you can start looking for evidence to use in your summary. So here's the next step. Describe how the writer begins the passage. You want to go back to that very first paragraph or section of the text, and you want to ask yourself these questions. What types of evidence does the author use? What does this evidence show the reader? Here's an example from the article, The Shifting Boundaries of Adolescence. This is the very first section. In yellow, I have highlighted the first type of evidence that I find in this article. Here, Ledford begins the article with an anecdote from LeVere as a test subject in Dr. Tanner's study in the mid-1900s. What I would do if I were in my Google document or my note catcher is I would highlight the quote or the part of the text that gives me this information, and then as a comment, I would insert this sentence to remind myself, oh, this is the part where Ledford begins the article with an anecdote, and that makes it a lot easier for me to write my summary later on. I also highlighted in the second paragraph, from LeVere's anecdote, we learned that Dr. Tanner was focused on determining the physical beginning and end of adolescence. Okay, so just another example of another piece of evidence that you could highlight, and then in the margins, as a comment, you could make your annotation. The next step is to describe what happens in the middle of the passage. So, what types of evidence does the author use in the middle section of the text? What does this evidence show the reader? Are there any turning points in the article? If so, describe them. So here you see we have two excerpts that I just grabbed from the middle of the passage. Remember that this text is pretty long. Assuming that you've jotted your gist for every section, this test should actually be easy, or simple, I should say. If you look here, I wrote next to the paragraph about Tanner's shortcomings. Despite those shortcomings, Ledford quotes a pediatrician who sees the value in Dr. Tanner's study as a point of reference. I also wrote next to this particular section, Ledford cites the perspective of Blakemore to drive home the idea that adolescence is a social construct that cannot be accurately measured. So, what I'm doing here again is trying to summarize the types of evidence that I see, and then trying to explain what we learn from that evidence. And here's a star to signal that this is a turning point in the passage, okay? Because the author starts off by using Tanner's study as a foundation, and then this is the point where Ledford, the author, starts to drive home this idea of adolescence as a social construct. So I put a star next to this because it is important to note that this is a turning point in the article, and so when I write my summary, it would be important to describe it. Now, finally, describe how the passage ends. How does the author end the passage? Do they wrap up their argument and or leave the reader thinking? I'm going to leave that to you to decide. So take a moment now, you can pause the video, read this paragraph, and see if you can identify what evidence the author is using and the impact that that is having on us as the reader. And with that, you're done with the analysis. Now it's time to write the summary. So you want to start with the very basic, which is in yellow I've highlighted, you want to start by naming the article and by naming the author. And then the second thing you want to do is make sure that you name the central argument, the main argument of the article. What I'm doing right now is clicking through what I hope illustrates to you how you should explain how the author develops the main idea throughout the text. So what I've done in purple, the words in purple are words that show me you're going through the text to identify how the author develops their argument. Words like begins, next, towards the end, ends, right? That shows me you're going from beginning to end. In gray, I've highlighted transition words that indicate relationship between the parts of your summary. So in the next section, then, afterwards, to show that, towards the end, finally, okay? All those transition words and phrases help us to understand the relationship between the parts of the text. And the last thing to note here is that I've put in red, okay, all the sentence ends. So all the periods to indicate that I've written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences. Okay? So after every time that you write, you want to make sure you check your work against the criteria for success. You want to make sure you can check off every single box because that'll ensure that you get the best grade possible.